The Sustainable Voice, bringing you big successes from small places worldwide.
Leigh, how's it going?
Hey, Ashish, all good here. How about you?
I'm good. I'm good. We're just coming off our last episodes. We're talking about Costa Rica, and it seems like we took a break from railing on international banks, but we're back now. We'll go
We're
back to that.
back. We're
We'll,
back. Well,
we'll
there's
go
just
back.
so much to talk about. I mean, there's constant fodder, I mean,
Yeah.
we could probably just talk about that
Well,
from now until the end of time.
you know what happens is every time we have an episode, before we have our episode, I'll test out talking points on people that are much smarter than me, right? I'll talk to
Mm.
economists, I'll talk to world bankers, I'll talk to analysts, and I'll test out some of the theories. And usually I'll get pushback saying, "Well, that's not exactly right.
Hmm.
It's this." I haven't got any pushback when I talk about the IMF. None,
Interesting.
none. And they're all in agreement. Like, yeah,
Hmm.
most of them, most of them are not even aware of what's happening, right? Not
Hmm.
even aware. And I think that's the part that is it's a bit concerning.
Yeah.
But I think from these ashes, there's inspirational stories of countries that find ways to come back. It's not a perfect road back or a perfect arch. There are still issues, but there is a road back. I know since that episode we recorded, I've been sending you links about what's happening in Pakistan, sending you links about what's happening in other parts of Asia, and specific in terms of what they're being asked to do,
Hmm.
and what they're being forced to do. And I think that's part of it as well. So.
Well, I know when I responded back and said, this is like straight out of Compton. I mean, it's pretty gangster some of the stuff
It
that's
totally
that's
is.
going on, and it's really crazy. But I love that some of these countries have the moral compass to
Mhm,
keep moving forward, even
mhm.
even being in a difficult position.
You're right. Like it basically comes down to, what they see. And I think we've always talked about the fact that at some point, uh, tourism is part of the equation. I chuckle, and chuckle is the wrong word, but I think it applies here. As of this recording, the presidential results of Venezuela are being challenged by the international community, say that they're not real, that
Mm.
the results are not recognized. And I thought about this, right? So we talked about oversight. And
Hmm.
I talked about, we had talked about oversight, and I thought about this, and I was one of the comments I tested out saying, we are calling for neutral observers. We're calling for neutral voter observers. We have neutral bodies that are watching over elections in countries to try to deliver a free and fair election. Does it always happen? Of course not. But the effort is being made.
Hmm.
So what we've talked about from the beginning is not a matter of right and wrong, it's a matter of consistency.
Right.
If the international community is going to ask for it there, then why wouldn't you ask for the same thing with an organization like the IMF or the World
Hmm.
Bank? Why wouldn't you ask for that? Yes, everybody pays into it. And not only that, but I think something that's important, and this is what happened in our topic today is Sri Lanka, that international or neutral oversight, it prevents these loans from being weaponized, right?
Hmm.
And you're seeing it happening, and I do mean that. I know that we have listeners from a broad array, and we talked about just yesterday how our listener base is growing rapidly, and which is fantastic.
Yeah, we
It
love it.
is we have to call a spade a spade. We just got a glimpse with this whole downtime with the airlines, with CrowdStrike and everything else and whatnot. We got a glimpse of what cyber terrorism would look like if that was weaponized,
Hmm.
right? If our platforms were weaponized and what it would do. That was a mistake. What happens if it's done on purpose? It's the same thing that applies here. When with a country like Sri Lanka, we have to understand that sometimes these countries, and I know some people will say, well, Why did they take the loans in the first place? No, you should not live beyond your means. I understand. But when you are desperate, when you have to feed, when you have to pay, when you have to provide, and your social services are completely defunded, and you have to, where does that money come from? So we have to remember, we can print money for now till the cows come home. Again, for now. At some point, we'll have to reckon with that. They can't. And, and I also stress that when people think about Sri Lanka, well, yes, but it's a poor country and, they should have thought about this. I would also stress that some of the brightest mathematicians in the world come from Sri Lanka. Some of the brightest technical minds in the world come from Sri Lanka. There are less than, I think, 15,000 chartered financial analysts in the world, CFA, and I know because I tried to become one of them when I was working in finance, a 3-year exam. Less than 15,000, and that number might even be lower. When I did, it was 7,200 in the world. You know where most of them were? Singapore.
Sri Lanka.
Yes.
No.
Well, Singapore, Sri Lanka, and other places, but Sri Lanka was on there, right? It was there. I'm not saying they lived in Sri Lanka, but the people who were working, some of their roots, a lot of them, their roots came from Sri Lanka. And that's important. So you're not dealing with a population that can't count.
Right. How did you, so your fascination with Sri Lanka may have gone on, go back further than I'm aware, but I've noticed you've dialed it up. It just probably in the last 3 to 4 months really started speaking about it. So what changed for you? What is bringing it to mind?
Well, I have relatives, not by blood, but by marriage, that are from Sri Lanka. That's the first thing. Our foundation had a project pre-pandemic that was working for several years with the youth development program with a hotel chain called Jetwing that was providing jobs for children of war. From children of war up in Jaffna. And these are families that left during the war and they were sending money back home, but the money was being used for substance abuse and more high mortality rates and finding jobs. And then, there's a clear difference between, India and Sri Lanka, between Sri Lanka and Thailand. And I started seeing these parallels. And as I started looking at all the different cultures in ancient Asia, right? So the Far East civilizations, from ancient Japan to ancient China to the Indochina, Thailand, Southeast Asia, all those ancient cultures. I started, I used to think that these cultures all flowed through India, which they do. However, they almost all flow through Sri Lanka. There is a 6 degrees of separation of these ancient civilizations, even to the point there was a research paper done about 9 years ago that talked about an island in the Andaman Sea, that a sunken island that could possibly be the oldest civilization on Earth, 10,000 years old at that time. So older than Sumeria, older than ancient Egypt, older than all of it. It hasn't been proven, but the fact that the conversation started was something. I've been infatuated with Sri Lanka for probably 15 years, right? And it was there from a tourism standpoint, just because of not just the rock, but I started seeing these parallels, some of these ancient cities, and seeing the parallels. Like one of the cities looks just like Ayutthaya in Thailand, in terms of how it's set up. You look at some of the cities in Sri Lanka, and that looks like Bagan in Myanmar. That looks like Ayutthaya. That looks like Siem Reap. That looks boom, boom, boom. And then you go to other places, like you go to Siem Reap at the temples of Angkor Wat. Look at the Hindu mythology that's there. That Hindu mythology doesn't come from any one spot in India. It comes from all over the subcontinent, including Sri Lanka, because you're talking about Vishnu, you're talking about Hanuman. That's a huge part of it. Hanuman's the monkey god. There's a specific mountain range in Sri Lanka that supposedly that's where that particular deity jumped off of that range and flew to India. His source is there, right? So Sri Lanka is this little small island country that's rewriting history books everywhere. And to me, I love when I start saying I'm a history buff, I'm a numbers buff, I love analyzing things. I have fun doing it. but I also don't like seeing little guys getting picked on.
Mm-hmm.
That just, what's the phrase from Peter Griffin of Family Guy? You know what really grinds my gears?
Oh, I didn't know you were a Family Guy
Oh,
fan.
yes,
I love that show too.
it's
It's
a
so good. So
fantastic,
smart.
fantastic show. It's well
Yeah.
written too.
Yeah, it is.
No.
It is.
So
Mm.
I want to think about this, okay? I want you to go back to school.
Mm.
Everybody had bullies in school, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember the kid whose lunch money was taken every single day?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Do you remember
So
the
that,
kid? You go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Do you remember the kid who had to do everybody's homework?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was me, by the way.
Yeah, it was me.
That was me.
Yeah.
Do you remember the kid who was made to feel like they were inferior?
Mm. Yeah.
That's Sri Lanka.
Mm.
That's what, and it's not just people. I want to take you back, go back to 2000 and the early part of the decade, the 2010s. So we talk about tourism, but in understanding tourism, we have to understand the plight that tourism took to get here, right? So Sri
Mm-hmm.
Lanka, tourism's not new in Sri Lanka. It's been there for a better part of 2 decades, and longer. But I want you to think about the fact that this country had endured a civil war for many years, right? The Civil War, it endured for decades. And then when the treaty was signed, when the peace treaty was signed, obviously rehabilitation takes over. And there's a window where the rehabilitation was taking place, the image, right? The country it was still just the dissension, but there was a healing, right? There was a path forward. And then there was a terrorist attack in 2018, right? That derailed everything. And then once it started coming back, there was okay that and this is again a tourist board that's underfunded. They don't have the money to fund it properly, so they do a lot of great work in UK and London. They don't quite reach the US yet, but there was certainly an effort to try to get back on its feet, and then the pandemic happened. So everything that was gained was wiped out, and everything that was lost all over again, and then there was more that was lost on top of that, right? Now, again, tourism isn't the only industry. There's tea, there's agriculture, there's, intellect, there's a whole bunch of exports that are coming out of Sri Lanka. But tourism is still a major driver, has been for the longest time. Then you start looking at the end of the pandemic, right? Or the years where the border started opening up and Sri Lanka has a complete coup. Right, I think it was the prime minister's house that was burnt down. There was the prime minister was removed. I believe the president was removed. There was a complete, absolute unseating of the government. That took 2 years. Right, so now you're talking about not 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. You're talking about almost 10 years, a lost decade of tourism. You might have a year here and there, but a lost decade. And you know what what nobody really talks about is the fact that the people who worked in tourism stayed in tourism.
Really, even through all that?
No, they didn't leave. I still talk to guides. I still talk to drivers. I still talk to operational people that are there, that were there pre-pandemic, are still there, and they went through the ringer and back. But we have to understand why the coup was happening, right? We stand here and go, there's a coup that happened there. Oh, they're unstable. Why are they unstable? Well, they were forced to borrow a lot of money from the IMF, from other countries, borrowing money left and right from a lot of different people. Was it responsible? Absolutely not. Was it something that needed to be done or had to be done? Like, did they need a new airport? Maybe, maybe not. But last time I checked, if we cross-reference to Uganda, they just built a brand new airport that was funded by the government of South Korea. So it's clearly not an isolated situation.
Right.
Right. So now you've got this country that now wants money from everybody, and then these stringent terms start showing up. And all these countries, just like I showed you in Pakistan, all these countries will come and say, well, just tax. You need to tax. You go, yes, good job. You're taxing your way through this. And they're applauding you, right? There's articles. The one I sent you, The IMF
Yeah.
applauds the process that Sri Lanka is taking, applauds the process Pakistan is taking. Yes, tax. Okay. Then what? Right? Then what? And what these
Yeah.
governments are forgetting. You remember that bully I was telling you about, right? In school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. How many people would come and stand up for the bully?
Oh gosh, hardly anyone.
Right. When you are traveling around, when you're traveling in your expedition ships and you went to certain countries, even when your girls were playing sports,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever been in a situation where few were doing the job of many?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like
That
what?
that happens a lot. Well, I mean, on ships, of course, the when everyone's not in sync and working together, then you've got this bitterness that comes out of, somebody else feeling like it's not fair, they're
Right.
doing more. And yeah,
Yeah.
it happens a lot in tight knit teams and if they're not working together for sure. But
Right.
even you and I both experienced it with our kids being on school projects where somebody's not doing it and your kid's the
Mhm.
one up at midnight doing somebody else's work
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Well, the same thing applies to taxpayers,
Mm-hmm.
right? I showed you in Pakistan what the IMF was trying to do in Pakistan. And out of a population of however many million, only 5 million pay taxes. And where a median income is $400 a month, that works out to $9,000 a year in just taxes that they have to pay. What incentive do you then have to actually even work? What
Mm-hmm.
incentive do you have? If the government's going to take 70% of what I'm going to make in taxes or 50%, why even bother getting a job? I'll just stay and get welfare, or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing in Sri Lanka, right? If you're going to take extra amount in taxation, why bother? And I had a conversation with an official. I can't use his name, but he was an official from the Sri Lankan government. I was actually had a great conversation. He was amazing. When I was in DC, and it was incredible because he was recounting the story, and he kept 4 times in a sentence. He said, "Thank God,
Oh,
thank God,"
really?
4 times in one sentence. Thank God. They were at that level where their hands were thrown up in the air, saying, "Please save me." Thank God, right? It started from there. You think about that. I think that's something that has to be talked about. That's something that has to be understood, right? In a country like Sri Lanka, where tourism is a major breadwinner, where agriculture is a major export, where the country has ambitions, but you've taken every major source of income. So you took away tourism, and it wasn't anybody's fault. It was an attack. It was a cowardly attack that happened, and it was at that nobody's fault. Nobody's at fault there except for the people who committed that crime.
Mm-hmm.
But then you closed their borders. So whatever avenues were left to make money was gone. And I know I've repeated this, but I've said this a couple of episodes ago. I'm not one of, this is not about vaccine, no vaccine, COVID, no COVID. This is about the World Health Organization and the World Bank not fully understanding the true contribution tourism makes to an economy and making decisions based on incomplete information and then staying quiet, which they're doing right now, while
Mm-hmm.
all these countries are left to pay the price. We are now in 2024. These borders opened 2 years ago. And yet here we are with the fallout. Here we are with complete fallout, having to repay this debt under stringent terms. All the people who loaned money, and I'm not saying it's the IMF's fault, right? You want to get repaid for your loans. I'm not saying it's their fault, but open your eyes.
Yeah.
Right? What's the phrase? Read the room.
Read the room. Yeah.
If a country, and again, we talk about consistency. If a country is not able to repay their debt, you'll go through and you'll repackage the deal. You'll go through and come to terms like they just did with Pakistan, they just did with Argentina, they just did with Costa Rica. No, sorry, not Costa Rica, with Ecuador. They just did with Colombia. They just did with a bunch of other countries. You'll repackage it. Right? Not every country is in the position of the US or India or Canada or Australia to start dictating terms. Argentina just took the gun and flipped it on its head. Not every country has the ability to do that.
That's good.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say, well, bad on them for loaning out money. No. But think about this for a second, okay? Sri Lanka was forced to borrow money from other countries to pay back initial loans. Then they had to borrow money from third parties to pay back the secondary loans. It's like taking a first, second, third, fourth, fifth mortgage on your house.
Mm-hmm. So who are they beholding to at this point?
Name the country.
Oh, really?
Name the
You
country.
talked a little bit about their neighbors. They're in a sort of precarious position.
Well, China has lent in as much money as the IMF, almost as much money as the IMF globally.
Wow.
You know, again, I'm not villainizing them, right? It is a form of economic colonization. I'm not villainizing them. It's not something that hasn't been done before. Right? The British Empire did it during the early part of the century or last century. So I'm not talking about villainizing them. But it is there, right? You just saw South Korea just fund a new airport in Uganda, right? What were the terms of that? As long as tourism is booming and exports are booming, fantastic. But there was a protest in Kampala last week against corruption. It's a minor protest, that's not going to have any impact. But what if?
Right.
What if? This is the problem. It's what I said in the beginning of this episode and previous episodes. Where's the consistency? How is it that you will let Argentina default 9 times? And then you're up in arms because Ukraine's defaulting. What do you want them to do? And then you're up in arms because Sri Lanka's defaulting. And then you're up in arms because XYZ country's defaulting. What would you want them to do? Then take it a step forward. It's one thing for them to take these loans and have, live beyond their bridges and then not pay it back. It's another thing to take these loans because you forced them to take these loans because you had shut every means of them being able to make money as a country. And then ask them, where's my money? What separates you from the Tony Sopranos of the world? What separates you from the Jimmy Hoffa's of the world? What separates you from I mean, you're right. I mean, what separates you from being that? What separates you from, what's the phrase? Is it racketeering? Is that the official term?
Maybe. That might be. Yeah.
I mean, how is this practice different? You said it best when we talked about, the lending practice. You said it best, predatory lending.
Yeah.
Right?
It is.
It is. I mean, look, some of these countries don't have a choice, right? The IMF was designed for these countries to help fragile economies. The World Bank was designed, and there's arguments about how the IMF is funded. Is it funded equally by the first world and whatnot? So my professor in college talked about the core and periphery system, right? And he talked about the fact that the core and periphery, the core is the first world, the periphery is the third world, and I'm generalizing, and the fact that that's going to turn on its head. He said in 1995 or 1996 that India was going to become a major player. We're there, right? We're there. Sri Lanka doesn't have that kind of GDP. Sri Lanka doesn't have it. It's never going to be that major player. Indonesia has emerged. Vietnam has emerged. China emerged a long time ago. We're at a precipice of a huge dynamic shift in that entire region. And what's happening is the gap between the haves and have-nots is growing wider. Right? And it's not through nobody's fault, but it is through predatory lending. It is through terms that are just not realistic.
And the people don't understand that. The people who are being burdened with trying to pay this back don't understand it at all.
No, if you are a citizen of a country like Sri Lanka and you are being told, well, we're going to tax you X amount, and there's corruption, and again, corruption is evident and rampant in these places because the door's open for it, right? If you find a $20 bill on the street, you and I are honest, we will try to find every which way to find the owner and give it back to them.
Yeah.
Once everything is exhausted, you can't find the owner, what happens to the money? You might donate it, you might do something, but you're conscious that this isn't your money.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. I feel like I will not. I do, like you said, I donated or try to
Yeah,
do something nice for somebody because
that's right.
I'm worried that it's cursed. It's not mine. I was
That's
not
right.
supposed to come into my hands.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. That's exactly right. You know, our belief is if you take somebody's money without taking it, you lose twice as much as penance. So our same boat, but we're in the minority. Right. So if you are a citizen of these countries, of course corruption is going to be rampant because it's the door's open for it. It's like putting a bunch of $20 bills on the ground to pick up and expecting everybody to be honest. It's not going to happen.
No.
Right. If you are opening and you're giving incentive to have self-gain, it's going to happen. And then on top of that, if you are then on top of that, actually, you know, going and putting in just austerity measures that are not realistic. Because you're forgetting the fact that the percentage of the population paying taxes is not like most countries.
Right.
Right? That's part of it as well. And then the citizens who are protesting, of course they're protesting. They don't want to be taxed. You see it happening in Kenya. You see it happening in Uganda. You see it happen. You saw it happening in Sri Lanka. You see it happening in the US. Look what happened all over. And this is important. I'll bring UK into this in a second. But think about this for a second. If we have incomplete information, if the government or the lending bodies, the global lending bodies, make decisions based on incomplete information, then don't the citizens have a right to react based on that same incomplete information?
Sure.
Right? They're protesting and you feel bad for them and say, I understand. Right?
Yeah.
Again, a small percentage of taxpayers. If you're in Pakistan right now and you're making $400 a month and you're being held to a tax bill worth $9,000 and you are paying your taxes like you're supposed to, you're the minority. What incentive do you have to keep being honest? What incentive do you have to keep paying your taxes? You are incentivizing corruption. You're incentivizing money laundering. You're incentivizing every aspect of the things we're trying to stop. And your incentive, yeah.
And crime, you know, even on just an individual level, crime and making poor judgment and decisions out of desperation and
Right.
So, well, where is Sri Lanka now with all of this? Tourism's coming back.
Tourism's come back very quickly. They're emerging quickly. They have a plan in place to repay their debt, right? They were given a plan, not even a reprieve, but a plan. But it's a plan where if there's another global turn down, I have a feeling it'll be forgiven or to be they'll default or whatever the case. But there is still a plan that but the plan just kicks the can down the road. It doesn't actually fix the problem. It kicks the can down the road. You know, as much as I hate to say it, but some of these loans that were given out during the pandemic, they're going to have to be granted. And I know the first question is, where does that money come from to pay for those grants? I don't know. I don't know. That's the question, right? Nobody knows, but we at least have to have that conversation.
I would think even just forgiving that, making it zero interest would help, but
even if they did that, these amounts are huge.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen, but even if they did that, these amounts are huge. And it, you know, look, tourism's a major driver of it. You know, in terms of, I'm working right now with a particular government, a country's government, to help calculate their tourism figures. And like most governments, the aggregate, the total they got, but when you break it down, you can see their numbers are flawed. How they're counting it is completely flawed, and they're not alone. What makes this country different is they're actually acknowledging that it's different, which I think is pretty powerful.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, but in the case of Sri Lanka, this is what I said earlier: you risk it being weaponized, right? What if this country says, well, I'm going to go to the major banks in the world, the HSBCs, the Citis, the JPs, and I'm going to borrow money from them, right? You're a country, you have sovereign some sovereign wealth, you have some credit behind it, some sovereign collateral behind it. So you're given loans. And this is like the Latin American debt crisis of the 80s all over again, right? You're borrowing money from these countries, or from these banks, excuse me. And all it takes is a leader who sees this. And what if he does that? Well, he or she does this, then goes to the governing bodies and says, now let me forgive this debt, or I'm going to actually default on that debt. These banks are going to be in trouble. And then the US economy, which is the major contributor to IMF, to the World Bank, their economy is going to be in trouble because I'm going to default on that debt. And not just me, but I'm going to call the world leaders of every single country who's in my position and tell them all to default and whatnot. What if they go to a larger power and broker a deal with them to say, hey, all these countries are going to default on their debt with the US. You fund them here. It's economic terrorism. We've just weaponized these loans. I know it sounds simplistic, and I know there's a bunch of people saying that's not possible. Let me remind you, we just had a global outage of airports and airlines all over the world.
Yeah.
This isn't political. We have to actually think about this, right? And I know I've talked about this several episodes, and some of you may think I'm, beating a dead horse, but it's not. It keeps happening. And I'll give you an example, right? So right now in the US, there's a huge movement about commercial loans, right, in the US. And it turns out all the commercial loans that have been given over the last decade, they're the ones that were done by Freddie Mac's Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they are. The numbers are skewed. What I mean by that is that proper validation wasn't done. Proper credit checks weren't done.
Are you talking about the SBA?
No, commercial loans. I'm talking about commercial real estate, commercial mortgages. Basically, it was basically like the home mortgages of the early 2000s all over again on the commercial side. And there's this huge cry. There has to be oversight. We have to have more credit worthiness, and we have to have more checks and whatnot. They're putting all these things in place now. Okay, but the loans are already given out. So if we're calling for oversight on that, why aren't we calling for oversight on this, on the IMF, on the World Bank? Why aren't we calling for oversight here? Right? Why aren't we taking the CEOs of the biggest banks in the world who have the most exposure in these countries and putting them as an oversight committee, as part of an oversight committee, to make sure that these loans are given out properly? Somebody who has a vested interest, right, in getting repaid, but in different ways. Maybe it's banks that are not invested, maybe banks that are invested. I don't know the answer to that, but why is it on an oversight board? And clearly, we talked about the article from the professor from the University of Pretoria. I'm not the only one who's talking about this.
Yes.
So the concern is not just what happens to these countries. Sri Lanka is emerging. It is a source of inspiration as to what's happening, because the fact that the country is excited, it's powerful. Our foundation is just now setting up with them to help, with tourism, to actually help replant seagrass along the western shores, to help the fishermen of Colombia. That's huge. The fact that all these things are in place is huge. It's a source of inspiration. But when a major government official is telling you, thank God.
Yeah.
That just tells you. Powerful people on their knees begging for help, and not from a powerful country, but up at the Almighty. That's the image I get.
Yeah.
Should never be brought to that.
No. So will they get out of it? What is your forecast for Sri Lanka? What do you think?
Honestly, I think they will, but I think the commercial mortgage situation in the US is going to have a lot to say about it.
Really?
I think the ripple effects of the commercial mortgage time bomb in the US is going to have a lot of effect around the world. They have a lot of impact just because of it depends on the impact in our banking system, because that's just it's a domino effect, right? So I think that's part of it. It's also people waking up, right? Look what happened in UK. right? With those poor attacks. And because of dissemination of information that it was some sort of asylum seeker that caused those attacks, which wasn't the case, you saw what protests happen in London. Misinterpretation of information is just as dangerous as incomplete information. Right? And we live in a world where everything gets amplified 1,000 times because of social media. Right? I mean, could you imagine if social media existed during the Latin American debt crisis?
Oh my gosh.
We'd have a run on all the banks all over the world. We would have a
Yes.
completely collapsing banking system. So to your question, it depends on what happens in the US, because the US is still a major funder. It depends on what happens. And I won't even get into politics. That's not what this is about. But just straight math. It's simple math. Not only that, but it depends also on the global economic outlook over the next 5 years. Like every major economy in the world has printed a ton of money during the pandemic to help keep themselves going. That bill is coming due. Could be in 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. But that bill is coming due. And it's not a political thing. It's not a conservative thing. It's not a liberal thing. It's a math thing. It's coming due. So when it does come due, it's not just a US issue. It's a global issue. The question becomes, how far along in the repayments is a country like Sri Lanka? How far along in reform is Sri Lanka? How much of their, and at that point, will the debt that is still owed be forgiven? Because there's bigger issues than the debt that country has taken. Right? I also find it kind of hypocritical that, you know, an organization like the IMF, which is majorly funded by countries like the US, and look, this is not political. This is, again, mathematical. Our debt is 100% of 120% of our GDP.
Yes.
We're basically insolvent as a country.
Yep.
Who are we to tell other countries about their credit rating? I mean, we don't really have a leg to stand on.
No.
And yet here we are funding. So I think it also comes down to oversight. Who's funding the IMF? What interests are being read or being addressed with those loans from the World Bank and IMF? And I know people will say the smartest people in the world, the smartest minds in the world work at these banks. I will only tell you this, that during 2020, it wasn't until September of 2020 the head of the World Bank sat next to the head of the WHO and said, we're creating a program for fragile economies. Shouldn't that have been done while you were contemplating closing the borders? Shouldn't that have been ready to go? And anybody who tells me, oh, well, it was hard to coordinate. Yeah, but that's what you're being paid for. That's why you're in that position, right? And you're not the one facing the repercussions. It's the people that you never met in Sri Lanka and Kenya and Argentina and every other place in the world. They're the ones paying the price for your inaction. And now you're calling out for loans to be repaid, loans that were forced to be taken because you didn't plan properly. That's my problem.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. We're gonna have to focus on solutions. I'd like to next episode.
Yeah,
we're gonna focus on
I want to. Yeah.
Because I don't want to be down. I'm a happy person. I don't want to.
Well, and you are very solution based. You are a doer, so and an inspirer. So I'm curious to find out. I know that you probably have some ideas, and probably that conversation that you had when you were in DC gave you.
It gave some ideas. I mean, there definitely are. But there are two things to take in place. One is how do we solve it? And again, it's not, right, or I'm sure it's been talked about, but inaction is just as dangerous as not having a plan.
It's true.
So we need to go through that. There are some pretty cool solutions, but more than anything else, Sri Lanka is it is a source of inspiration. It really is, because this is a country that probably shouldn't have found a way out of this, and yet they did. Right? The GDP isn't big enough to call the shots, yet it is. But Sri Lanka, and this is something this minister said as well, which I think is very important, is Sri Lanka understands better than most about their geographic dynamic. Right? There is a shift that is occurring in our world economy where periphery countries are now becoming world powers. They're becoming dominant GDPs, and the haves and have-nots, that disparity can't be wide. Otherwise, you're going to have colonization could be a risk that occurs afterwards. Right? So there has to be, like for example, the EU, and we'll talk about this next episode, but the EU is a good idea that was executed with flaws. It was poorly executed, but it was a good idea and concept. But it was poorly executed, and they paid the price for it when we had all the financial crisis in Europe. So I think next episode, I would like to talk about that, because that is something that's one of the solutions among many. But it's there, it's coming. We just have to open our eyes and be willing to understand it.
Well, that's what we're here to do.
That's it, exactly.
What you're here to do. My eyes are.
We're here to educate and scare.
No fear mongering.
No fear mongering. No. I'm not running for public office. I can't fear monger.
Yeah, no. All right, my friend, you want to bring us home?
Absolutely. So, thanks everybody for listening. Thank you so much for joining us. Those of you that have been part of the new growth, and those of you that have stayed with us in the beginning, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for staying with us. Thanks for being part of our growth. Remember, this podcast is about big successes in small places. It's about making sure that you're part of a change. So in your life, be part of a change in your part of your life. Be a big part of that change. Bring those ideas forward. Don't be afraid to speak up. We all should.
I love it. Thank you, Ashish.
All right. Thank you.